Eva Thornfield's trembling hands gripped the courthouse rail as Judge Blackwood's gavel hung suspended in the desert air, 6 pairs of desperate eyes burning into her back. The words she'd dreaded for 3 months echoed through the packed Tombstone courtroom like a death sentence. This court finds the children's current living arrangement unsuitable. Rebecca's sharp intake of breath cut through the stunned silence. Hope's small hand found Eva's skirt, clutching the worn fabric like a lifeline. The sound of shuffling boots and whispered prayers filled the space as townsfolk shifted uncomfortably, some nodding approval, others shaking their heads in disgust. Eva remembered another courtroom, another life, when she'd buried her own baby in Ohio soil. She'd sworn never to feel that helpless again. "Your Honor," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the thundering of her own heartbeat. "These children are my family." But how had a simple cooking job become a fight for everything she'd ever loved? And would 3 months of devotion be enough to save them all? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Eva Thornfield stepped off the dusty stagecoach in Tombstone, Arizona, clutching her worn carpet bag and the last $23 to her name. The desert heat struck her like a physical blow, so different from the green hills of Ohio where she'd buried her husband and infant daughter. Her black mourning dress clung to her skin, a constant reminder of the life she'd left behind. The advertisement in the territorial newspaper had been brief. Widower seeks housekeeper, 6 children, cooking, cleaning, remote ranch, serious inquiries only. She'd written immediately, desperate for any chance to start over somewhere her ghosts couldn't follow. Sheriff James McKenzie waited by the courthouse steps, his badge catching the harsh sunlight. At 38, he carried himself with the careful precision of a man holding himself together by sheer will. His dark hair showed premature silver at the temples, and his blue eyes held shadows that spoke of losses too deep for words. When he spotted Eva, his jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "Mrs. Thornfield?" His voice carried the rough edge of the frontier, weathered by wind and grief. "I'm Sheriff McKenzie." Eva straightened her shoulders, drawing on reserves of strength she'd thought depleted. "Thank you for meeting me, Sheriff. I'm grateful for this opportunity." He studied her face with the assessing gaze of a lawman. "Ranch is 15 miles out, hard country. My girls—" He paused, something flickering across his features. "They've been without a woman's influence for 2 years now, since their mother passed." As they rode toward Copper Creek Ranch in his weathered wagon, James spoke little, but Eva caught glimpses of the man beneath the badge. His hands, scarred from ranch work and frontier justice, held the reins with gentle competence. When they passed Apache petroglyphs carved into red rock, his shoulders tensed, and she noticed how his right hand unconsciously moved toward his sidearm. The ranch house appeared like a mirage against the vast Arizona landscape, timber and adobe, built to withstand both Apache raids and desert storms. 6 faces peered from windows and doorways as the wagon approached, ranging from 16-year-old Rebecca's defiant glare to 6-year-old Mercy's wide, silent stare. "Girls," James called, his voice softening for the first time, "come meet Mrs. Thornfield." They emerged slowly, a collection of sun-bleached hair and wary eyes. Rebecca stepped forward first, chin raised in challenge. "Another one, Papa? How long's this one staying?" The question hung in the dry air like gunpowder smoke. Eva felt the weight of their collective skepticism, their hard-earned distrust of promises that might be broken. These weren't just children needing care, they were survivors, battle-scarred by loss and abandonment. "As long as you'll have me," Eva replied quietly, meeting each pair of eyes in turn. "I'm not here to replace anyone. I'm here to help." Little did she know that in accepting this job, She'd just walked into a battle that would test everything she believed about family, love, and the courage to fight for both. Eva's first morning at Copper Creek Ranch began before dawn with the sound of boots on wooden floors and hushed voices that stopped abruptly when she appeared in the kitchen doorway. James stood at the stove, attempting to scramble eggs while simultaneously braiding 8-year-old Charity's hair. The result was both burnt breakfast and a lopsided braid that would have made Eva smile under different circumstances. "Morning," she said softly, not wanting to startle anyone. 6 pairs of eyes turned toward her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. "Thought I might help with breakfast." Rebecca, the eldest at 16, crossed her arms defensively. "We've been managing just fine on our own." Her voice carried the bitter edge of someone who'd been forced to grow up too fast, too young. Eva nodded respectfully. "I'm sure you have. But now you don't have to." She moved carefully around the kitchen, noting the burnt pot bottoms, the mismatched dishes, the way little Mercy sat silent in the corner, watching everything with enormous eyes that hadn't shed a tear since Eva's arrival. As she salvaged the eggs and started fresh biscuits, Eva observed the family dynamics with the careful attention her physician father had taught her. Grace, 14, understood Apache hand signals. Eva caught her making subtle gestures toward the window when coyotes howled in the distance. Faith, 12, kept glancing toward the door as if expecting someone. Hope, 10, flinched whenever anyone moved too quickly. And Mercy, the youngest at 6, hadn't spoken a single word since Eva arrived. The real revelation came that first night. Eva woke to the sound of floorboards creaking in the hallway. Through her bedroom door she glimpsed a shadow moving past, James, walking slowly, deliberately, but his eyes were closed. In his right hand he carried his Colt .45, finger resting near the trigger. Her blood ran cold. She'd read about this condition in her father's medical journals. Soldiers returning from war with minds that couldn't distinguish between past battles and present safety. James was sleepwalking, reliving whatever horror had taken his wife and partner 2 years ago. Eva held her breath as he paused outside the girl's room, his unconscious mind apparently checking for threats that existed only in his tortured dreams. After what felt like an eternity, he continued down the hall and out onto the porch, where he stood sentinel until dawn broke over the desert horizon. The next morning, James appeared at breakfast with no memory of his midnight patrol. When Eva searched his face for any sign of awareness, she found only the controlled exhaustion of a man running on empty. "Sleep well, Mrs. Thornfield?" he asked, pouring coffee with steady hands that had held a loaded weapon just hours before. "Yes, thank you," she lied, understanding instinctively that revealing his condition could destroy this fragile family. Whatever demons haunted James Mackenzie's sleep were his burden to bear, until Eva could figure out how to help him bear it. The town of Tombstone proved less welcoming than the ranch. When Eva accompanied James to the general store that second week, she felt the weight of curious stares and whispered conversations that stopped when she approached. Mrs. Patterson, the banker's wife, made a point of examining Eva's simple dress and worn shoes with obvious disapproval. "Sheriff Mackenzie," Mrs. Patterson said with false sweetness, "I see you found another housekeeper. Such a practical arrangement." The emphasis on practical carried implications that made Eva's cheeks burn. She was about to respond when James stepped closer, his presence suddenly commanding. "Mrs. Thornfield is family," he said quietly, but his tone brooked no argument. "I'd appreciate her being treated as such." Family. The word hit Eva like a physical blow, not because it wasn't true, but because it was becoming true in ways she hadn't expected. When little Mercy tugged on her skirt that afternoon and whispered her first word in months, "Mama," Eva felt something crack open in her chest. a place she'd kept sealed since burying her own child. "I'm not your mama, sweetheart," Eva whispered back, kneeling to Mercy's level. "But I'm here, and I'm staying." The lie came easily because the truth was too terrifying to voice. She was already falling in love with these broken, brave children and their haunted father. But love, in this harsh land, came with a price. Eva sensed it in the way townsfolk watched her, in the whispered conversations that died when she entered rooms, in the calculating stare of Judge Blackwood when he rode past the ranch with his territorial authority gleaming on his vest. Something was building in Tombstone, a storm that had nothing to do with weather and everything to do with a widow who dared to love someone else's children. Eva just didn't know yet how devastating that storm would be. The turning point came on a Tuesday morning when Apache smoke signals appeared on the distant mesas, thin gray columns rising against the azure sky like skeletal fingers. Eva was hanging laundry when Grace spotted them first, her sharp intake of breath drawing everyone's attention to the horizon. "Papa!" Grace called, her voice tight with controlled fear. "3 columns, northwest ridge." James emerged from the barn, his hand automatically checking his sidearm. Eva watched his face transform from the gentle father she'd come to know into the hard-eyed sheriff who'd survived 2 years of frontier justice. The change was swift and complete, like watching a mask slide into place. "Rebecca, get the rifles from the gun case," he commanded. "Grace, help me secure the livestock. Ava," he paused, seeming to remember she was there. "Can you handle a weapon?" "My father taught me," Eva replied, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. What she didn't mention was that her father, Dr. Samuel Thornfield, had been one of the few white physicians willing to treat Apache wounded during the territorial conflicts. She'd learned to shoot not from hatred but from necessity. By noon, the Apache threat had materialized into something far worse than smoke signals. The Henderson Ranch, 5 miles east, had been hit hard. James rode out with the territorial posse, leaving Eva alone with 6 children and explicit instructions to barricade the house if trouble came their way. "He shouldn't have left us," Rebecca muttered, pacing the kitchen like a caged mountain lion. "Mama never would have been left alone like this." The comparison stung, but Eva understood the girl's fear. "Your papa has responsibilities to the whole territory. We'll manage." "Like we always do," Rebecca shot back, her 16-year-old bravado cracking to reveal the terrified child beneath. That's when Eva discovered the family's first secret. As she checked the rifle loads, Grace approached with careful steps. "Mrs. Thornfield," she said quietly, "there's something you should know about the Apache." Eva looked up from the Winchester, noting how Grace's hands moved in subtle gestures, hand signals she'd seen Apache scouts use near the trading posts. "My mama," Grace continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "She taught me their language. Before she died, she made me promise to use it to protect the family if I ever needed to." "Your mother knew Apache?" Eva kept her tone neutral, understanding this was a dangerous secret in a territory where such knowledge could be seen as collaboration. Grace nodded. "She grew up near the reservation. Said understanding your enemy was the first step to surviving them." She hesitated, then added, "But they weren't always enemies." "Before the raid started, before everything went wrong, some of them were friends." The revelation explained so much. Grace's awareness of desert dangers, her ability to predict Apache movements, the way she watched the horizon with knowledge rather than just fear. It also created a new problem. If the town discovered this family connection to Apache culture, it would provide ammunition for anyone looking to question James's fitness as both sheriff and father. Before Eva could respond, the sound of hoofbeats thundered across the desert floor. But instead of James returning with the posse, a single rider approached under a white flag. Eva's blood ran cold as she recognized the rider. an Apache scout she'd seen near Tombstone, now approaching their ranch alone and apparently seeking parley. "Grace," Eva said urgently, "I need you to translate." The next few minutes unfolded like a fever dream. Through Grace's halting translation, Ava learned that a group of Apache children had been separated from their band during the Henderson raid. They were hiding in the wash behind the ranch, wounded and terrified. The scout wasn't seeking conquest. He was asking for help. "He says his chief's daughter is hurt bad," Grace whispered, her face pale with the weight of decision. "She's maybe 8 years old. Internal bleeding, he thinks." Eva felt the ghost of her father's voice. A physician's oath knows no color, no creed, no nationality. Life is life, and suffering demands response. But helping Apache children would be seen as treason by many in Tombstone. It could destroy James's career, scatter his children to distant relatives, and brand Eva as a collaborator. "Tell him to bring them," Ava said quietly. Rebecca gasped. "Are you insane? Papa will lose his badge." "We'll all be branded as Apache sympathizers. Your papa took an oath to protect all children in this territory," Ava replied, already gathering medical supplies. "Sometimes protecting means making hard choices." What followed tested every skill Eva had learned from her physician father. The Apache girl, barely older than Mercy, had internal injuries that required immediate surgery. Working by lamplight in the ranch kitchen, with Grace translating desperate instructions and Faith holding instruments, Eva performed the most difficult medical procedure of her life. The irony wasn't lost on her. She was saving an Apache child in the same kitchen where she'd been trying to save a broken American family. As dawn broke, the little girl's fever broke with it. The Apache scout knelt before Eva, speaking words Grace translated with wonder. "He says you are medicine woman with good heart. His chief will remember this debt." But their moment of triumph was shattered by the thunder of approaching horses. James had returned with the posse, and from their expressions they'd already spotted the Apache scout's horse. "Ava!" James's voice carried across the desert, sharp with panic, and something that might have been betrayal. "Step away from them, now." Standing in her kitchen doorway, an Apache child in her arms and 6 terrified American children behind her, Ava realized she'd just crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The choice she'd made in the name of humanity might cost her everything she'd come to love. Behind the posse, she spotted a familiar figure, Judge Cornelius Blackwood, his territorial authority gleaming in the morning sun and his calculating eyes already assessing the scene for maximum legal impact. The battle for her family was about to begin. The weeks following the Apache incident transformed Copper Creek Ranch from a place of healing into a fortress under siege. Word of Eva's collaboration with Apache spread through Tombstone like wildfire, carried on the tongues of men who'd never faced a dying child or held a mother's tears in their hands. The territorial newspaper ran a scathing editorial titled, "The Enemy Within, Foreign Sympathies in Our Midst," though Eva had been born in Ohio and carried citizenship papers to prove it. Judge Blackwood began making regular visits to the ranch, always under the pretense of routine territorial business. But his calculating eyes took inventory of every interaction between Eva and the children. He carried a leather portfolio that grew thicker with each visit, filled with witness statements and legal precedents that Eva could only imagine. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said during one particularly tense visit, settling his considerable frame into James's best chair uninvited, "I understand you have medical training. My father was a physician. He taught me basic care." Eva kept her voice level, though her hands trembled as she poured coffee. Through the window she could see Faith teaching little Mercy to braid horsehair, innocent moments that felt precious under Blackwood's scrutiny. Ah, yes, Dr. Samuel Thornfield of Cincinnati. Quite the reputation for unconventional patience. Blackwood's smile never reached his eyes. Tell me, did he also teach you the Hippocratic Oath? First, do no harm. The implication hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Eva set down the coffee pot with deliberate care. My father taught me that suffering has no nationality, Judge Blackwood. A child's pain is just that, a child's pain. Noble sentiment, dangerous application. Blackwood opened his portfolio, revealing pages of careful script. I have 17 affidavits from concerned citizens questioning your suitability as guardian to these children. Would you care to review them? Before Eva could respond, Rebecca burst through the kitchen door, her face flushed with fury and adolescent indignation. You can't just come here and threaten our family. Rebecca, Eva warned, but the girl was beyond caution. My mama died protecting us from Apache raids, and now you want to punish Eva for saving a little girl. What kind of Christian are you? Blackwood's expression softened in a way that somehow made him more dangerous. Child, I'm trying to protect you, all of you. This woman has brought danger to your doorstep, divided your community, and placed your father's career in jeopardy. Is that the action of someone who truly cares for your welfare? The question struck home because it contained enough truth to wound. Eva had brought controversy to this family, had forced them into a spotlight that revealed all their vulnerable places. But before doubt could take root, little Mercy appeared in the doorway, moving with the careful steps of a child who'd learned to read adult tensions. Mama Eva, Mercy said clearly, using the name that had evolved naturally over the past month. Why is the mean man making you sad? The silence that followed was deafening. Blackwood's eyes sharpened with the intensity of a predator spotting weakness. In that moment, Eva realized her mistake. Mercy's innocent words had just provided the judge with exactly the ammunition he needed. Mama Eva, Blackwood repeated slowly, writing in his portfolio. How interesting. Tell me, child. Do you remember your real mother? Mercy's small face crumpled with confusion. Mama Sarah went to heaven. Mama Eva takes care of us now. Two mothers, Blackwood murmured, still writing. How confusing that must be for a young mind. That evening, James returned from town with news that drained the color from his weathered face. There's going to be a hearing, he said without preamble. Blackwood's filed formal papers questioning the children's living situation. Eva felt the world tilt beneath her feet. When? 2 weeks. Territorial courthouse in Tombstone. James ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Eva had come to recognize as his response to impossible situations. Eva, I need you to understand something. If this goes badly, they could separate the children, send them back east to relatives, or worse, to territorial orphanages. The thought of these 6 girls, who'd already lost so much, being scattered to the winds, made Eva physically ill. What can we do? Fight, Rebecca said fiercely from the doorway. We fight for our family. But fighting required understanding the enemy, and Judge Blackwood proved more complex than Eva had initially realized. Through careful questioning of townspeople and fragments of overheard conversations, she began to piece together his story. Cornelius Blackwood had lost his only son, Thomas, in the same Apache raid that had taken Sarah Mackenzie. Thomas had been James's deputy, a young man of 24 with dreams of bringing law and order to the frontier. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Grace, who'd been quietly conducting her own investigation with the focused intensity of a child protecting her family. Mrs. Thornfield, Grace said one evening as they worked together in the kitchen, I heard something in town today. about Judge Blackwood." Eva looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, noting the careful way Grace chose her words. "Mrs. Henderson was talking to Mrs. Patterson at the general store. She said Judge Blackwood hasn't been the same since his boy died. Said he blamed Papa for not bringing Thomas home alive." The pieces began forming a clearer picture. Blackwood wasn't just a territorial judge exercising authority, he was a grieving father looking for someone to blame for his son's death. James had returned from that raid alive. Thomas Blackwood had not. In the judge's mind, Eva represented another way James was moving forward, while his own son remained forever frozen in the desert grave. This understanding changed Eva's strategy entirely. She began reaching out to the community in ways that hadn't occurred to her before, visiting families she'd treated during various medical emergencies, reminding people of the good she'd done rather than just the controversy she'd created. Mrs. Chen, whose husband Eva had treated for a rattlesnake bite, proved unexpectedly supportive. "That woman saved my Ben's life," she declared loudly at the general store when others questioned Eva's character. "Don't care what language the snake spoke, dead is dead, and she brought him back." Similarly, old Pete Morrison, whose granddaughter Eva had delivered during a difficult birth, became a vocal defender. "Some folks got short memories," he grumbled to anyone who'd listen. "That lady's got healing hands, and healing don't know color or creed." But for every supporter Eva gained, Blackwood seemed to find two detractors. The campaign against her intensified when someone, Eva suspected who but couldn't prove it, began spreading rumors about her financial situation. Suddenly, everyone knew she'd arrived in Tombstone with less than $25, that she'd sold her wedding ring to buy medical supplies, that she was clearly a fortune hunter seeking to secure her future through the sheriff's children. The financial pressure became real when the ranch's mortgage payment came due. James had been using his sheriff's salary to support 6 children. There was simply no extra money for Eva's wages, much less the legal fees mounting from Blackwood's challenge. Eva made the decision that nearly broke her heart. She sold her father's medical bag, the one inheritance she'd carried from Ohio, to help cover expenses. When James discovered what she'd done, his reaction surprised her with its intensity. "You can't keep sacrificing everything for us," he said, his voice rough with emotion they'd both been trying to ignore. "This isn't your fight, Eva." "Yes, it is," she replied simply. "They're my children, too." The admission hung between them like a bridge neither had expected to cross. For weeks they'd been circling around feelings that grew stronger with each shared meal, each crisis weathered together, each moment of watching the other care for children who desperately needed stability. "Eva," James said softly, and she heard years of loneliness in the way he spoke her name. But before the moment could develop further, Hope came running into the kitchen with news that shattered their brief peace. "Papa! Mama Eva! Come quick! Men with torches are riding toward the ranch." Through the window, Eva could see at least a dozen riders approaching in the gathering dusk, their torches creating an ominous constellation against the desert sky. At their head rode Judge Blackwood, his territorial authority giving legal weight to what looked suspiciously like a lynch mob. "Rebecca," James commanded, his voice sharp with authority, "get your sisters to the root cellar, now." "No," Rebecca said firmly, "we stand together, or we fall together." As the riders drew closer, Eva realized this wasn't just about legal custody anymore. This had become something much more dangerous. A test of whether love and courage could triumph over fear and prejudice in a land where justice often came at the end of a rope rather than from the pages of a law book. The battle for her family was about to become literal, and Eva found herself wondering if her father's medical oath would be enough to save them all. The torchlight procession stopped just beyond rifle range, a calculated distance that spoke of men who understood both intimidation and self-preservation. Judge Blackwood dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate and theatrical in the flickering orange light. Behind him, Eva recognized faces from town, shopkeepers, ranchers, men she'd nodded to politely at church just last Sunday, now transformed into something harder and more dangerous. "Sheriff Mackenzie," Blackwood called across the desert air, his voice carrying the authority of territorial law. "I have a warrant for the immediate removal of these children from what the court deems an unsafe environment." James stepped onto the porch, his badge catching the torchlight like a star against his vest. "Judge, it's past 8 o'clock. Legal papers are served during business hours, not by armed men in the dark." "Extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures," Blackwood replied smoothly. "We have credible reports that Apache sympathizers are hiding on this property. The safety of 6 innocent children takes precedence over procedural niceties." Eva felt her heart slam against her ribs. Behind her she could hear the girls' frightened breathing, could sense their terror at seeing their world threatened once again. Mercy's small hand slipped into hers, trusting and warm, and Eva felt something fierce and protective rise in her chest like a wildfire. "There are no Apache on this property," Eva called out, stepping to James's side despite his warning look. "There are only children who need their family." "Ah, Mrs. Thornfield." Blackwood's smile was visible even at this distance. "The very person we've come to discuss. Tell me, have you informed the sheriff about your father's rather colorful reputation? Dr. Samuel Thornfield, known throughout Ohio for treating runaway slaves and Indian raiders alike. Some might say such sympathies run in families." The accusation hit like a physical blow. Eva heard James's sharp intake of breath, felt the subtle shift in his posture that told her this was news to him. In that moment, she realized how carefully Blackwood had orchestrated this confrontation, using half-truths and inflammatory language to drive wedges between people who should trust each other. "My father treated anyone who needed help," Eva said clearly, her voice carrying across the desert. "That's what physicians do. That's what decent people do." "Decent people," Blackwood repeated, savoring the words. "Yes, let's discuss decency. Is it decent for a woman of questionable background to insert herself into a grieving family? To manipulate children's affections? To endanger their lives with dangerous associations?" Rebecca suddenly pushed past Eva onto the porch, her 16-year-old fury blazing like one of their torches. "Nobody manipulated us. We chose her. She saved Mercy when she was sick with fever. She stopped Grace's nightmares. She taught Faith to read better, and she made Hope laugh for the first time since Mama died. Child," Blackwood's voice took on a patronizing tone that made Eva's blood boil, "you're too young to understand how adults can exploit your emotions for their own gain. And you're too old to remember what it feels like to be loved instead of used," Rebecca shot back with devastating accuracy. The judge's face darkened, and Eva saw something dangerous flicker in his eyes. This wasn't just about territorial law or child welfare. This was personal. Blackwood wasn't just a grieving father seeking justice. He was a broken man, lashing out at anyone who dared to find happiness he'd been denied. That's when Grace made her move. Before anyone could stop her, the 14-year-old stepped forward and began speaking in fluent Apache, her young voice carrying clearly across the desert. The reaction from the townsmen was immediate and explosive. Shouts of outrage, demands for explanation, the metallic sound of weapons being cocked and loaded. "What is that girl saying?" one of the riders shouted. Grace stopped speaking and looked directly at Judge Blackwood. "I told the desert spirits that evil men with weak hearts were trying to steal children from their protectors. I asked them to remember these faces, so they'd know who to visit in their dreams." The silence that followed was electric with tension and superstition. These were frontier men who'd lived through Apache raids and unexplained disappearances, who understood that the desert held mysteries their civilized minds couldn't fully grasp. Grace's words, delivered with calm certainty, had introduced an element of supernatural dread that no legal warrant could address. But Blackwood recovered quickly, his lawyer's mind finding the advantage in Grace's revelation. "You see," he called to his followers, "this family has been so corrupted by Indian influence that even the children speak their heathen tongue. What Christian parent would allow such contamination? A parent who wants their children to survive," James said quietly, his words carrying deadly calm. "Grace learned Apache because her mother believed knowledge was better than ignorance. Understanding your neighbor is better than fearing them. Your dead wife's misguided beliefs don't justify exposing innocent children to savage influences," Blackwood snapped, and Eva saw James's face go dangerously still. "Judge," James said softly, and his tone made several of the riders shift uncomfortably in their saddles. "You just spoke ill of my late wife in front of my children. That's a line you shouldn't have crossed." The confrontation might have escalated to violence if not for an unexpected interruption. From the darkness beyond the torchlight came the sound of approaching horses, not the chaotic noise of another mob, but the disciplined cadence of a military patrol. Colonel Morrison of the Territorial Garrison emerged into the flickering light, his blue uniform pristine despite the desert dust, his weathered face stern with authority that superseded even Blackwood's judicial power. "Judge Blackwood," the colonel said without preamble, "I understand you're conducting official business rather late in the evening." Blackwood's confidence wavered slightly. "Colonel Morrison, yes. We're executing a warrant for child protection." "Interesting," Morrison replied dryly. "Because I've just come from the Apache camp where Chief Red Cloud is recovering from recent wounds. Seems someone saved his granddaughter's life recently. Little girl named Small Bird, about 8 years old, internal injuries from a horse fall." Eva felt the world shift beneath her feet. The Apache child she'd operated on hadn't been a raid casualty. She'd been injured in an accident, and her family had brought her to the nearest source of medical help. The entire premise of Blackwood's accusations was built on a lie. "The chief wanted me to deliver a message," Morrison continued, his voice carrying clearly to every man present. "He says the woman with healing hands has brought honor to her people, and anyone who harms her or her family will answer to the Apache Nation." He also mentioned that he's ordered his warriors to withdraw from territorial boundaries as a gesture of respect for her courage. The revelation rippled through the crowd like wildfire. Eva hadn't just aided the enemy, she'd potentially prevented a larger conflict. Her medical intervention had earned the respect of one of the territory's most feared Apache leaders and resulted in a peaceful withdrawal that could save dozens of lives. Blackwood's face went white, then red with fury. "That changes nothing. The law requires common sense," Morrison interrupted. "Mrs. Thornfield's actions have brought more peace to this territory than 10 years of military campaigns. Any man who threatens her is threatening territorial security." One by one, the townsmen began lowering their torches, the fight going out of them as quickly as it had flared. They'd come expecting to confront a traitor and instead found themselves facing a woman whose courage had earned the respect of both her enemies and the territorial army. But Blackwood wasn't finished. As his supporters melted away into the darkness, he stepped forward with the desperate fury of a man whose carefully constructed narrative was crumbling. "This isn't over," he said, his voice shaking with emotion that went deeper than legal defeat. "I have legal authority over child welfare in this territory, and I will not allow what?" James stepped down from the porch, his movement fluid and dangerous. "Allow my children to be happy. Allow them to heal. Allow them to love someone who loves them back. Allow them to forget their real mother," Blackwood exploded. And in that moment of raw pain, Eva finally understood the true source of his obsession. "You get to move on, get a new wife, build a new life, while my boy stays dead in the ground. Where's the justice in that?" The desert silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant cry of a night bird and the soft sobbing of children who'd heard too much adult pain for their young hearts to bear. "Thomas wouldn't want this," James said softly. "Your boy was a good man, Judge. He died protecting innocence. He wouldn't want his death used to hurt more innocents." For a moment, Blackwood's face crumpled with grief so raw and desperate that Ava felt her heart break for him despite everything. Then his expression hardened again, rebuilding the walls that grief had momentarily breached. 2 weeks, he said, mounting his horse with stiff dignity. "The hearing proceeds as scheduled. We'll let the law decide what's best for these children." As the last torch disappeared into the desert darkness, Ava found herself surrounded by 6 children and 1 man who'd chosen to stand with her against the storm. But she knew the real battle was just beginning, and Judge Blackwood's grief made him more dangerous than any Apache raid ever could. The territorial courthouse in Tombstone had never seen such a crowd. By 8 o'clock on the morning of the hearing, every seat was filled with townspeople, ranchers, miners, and curious onlookers drawn by weeks of gossip and speculation. Ava sat at the defendant's table wearing her best dress, a simple blue cotton that Rebecca had insisted brought out her eyes, and tried to control the trembling in her hands as Judge Blackwood took his position behind the bench. The irony wasn't lost on her that the man prosecuting her case was also presiding over it. But territorial law in 1885 Arizona afforded few luxuries of impartiality. Blackwood wore his judicial robes like armor, his grief transformed into cold legal precision that made him more formidable than any emotional outburst could have. "This hearing," Blackwood began, his voice carrying to every corner of the packed courtroom, "will determine whether the current living arrangements for the 6 minor children of Sheriff James McKenzie serve their best interests, or whether alternative custody arrangements are required." Ava felt James tense beside her. Behind them, the 6 girls sat in a row like a jury of angels, their faces pale but determined. Rebecca had braided everyone's hair that morning, including her own, in a show of family unity that made Eva's heart ache with pride and terror. The prosecution began with devastating efficiency. Blackwood called witness after witness to paint a picture of Eva as an opportunistic outsider who'd manipulated her way into a vulnerable family. Mrs. Patterson testified about Eva's suspicious arrival with minimal belongings and no local references. The territorial postmaster revealed that Eva had received no mail from family or friends in Ohio, suggesting she'd severed all previous connections for reasons unknown. "Tell me, Mrs. Patterson," Blackwood said smoothly, "in your 30 years of frontier life, have you ever seen a respectable woman travel alone to take employment with a single man and his children?" "Never," Mrs. Patterson replied with righteous certainty. "Decent women don't put themselves in such compromising positions." Each witness drove another nail into Eva's reputation, and she watched helplessly as the community she'd tried to serve turned against her with the pack mentality that frontier life often bred. But the most damaging testimony came from an unexpected source. Dr. Williams, the territorial physician who'd treated Ava's predecessor, took the stand with obvious reluctance. Under Blackwood's questioning, he revealed that Eva had been asking detailed questions about laudanum, chloroform, and other medical substances that could be used for purposes beyond healing. "In your professional opinion, Dr. Williams," Blackwood pressed, "could someone with Mrs. Thornfield's medical knowledge use these substances to influence behavior, perhaps make children more compliant or affectionate?" The suggestion hung in the air like poison gas. Eva shot to her feet, her chair scraping against the wooden floor. "That's monstrous! I would never—" "Mrs. Thornfield," Blackwood's voice cracked like a whip, "you will remain seated and silent unless called upon to testify." The morning continued its relentless demolition of Eva's character. When Blackwood called Rebecca to the stand, Eva felt her world begin to crumble. The 16-year-old walked forward with her chin raised, but Eva could see the tremor in her hands, the way she avoided looking at the family she was about to betray. "Rebecca," Blackwood's voice gentled in a way that made Eva sick. "I know this is difficult, but the court needs to understand the truth about your home situation. Has Mrs. Thornfield ever made you feel uncomfortable?" Rebecca's eyes darted to Eva, filled with an anguish that spoke of impossible choices and desperate calculations. She makes us call her Mama Ava," Rebecca said quietly, "even though our real mama is dead." The courtroom erupted in whispers and gasps. Ava felt the words like physical blows, not because they were lies, but because they were truth twisted into weapons. "And how does that make you feel?" Blackwood pressed gently. "Confused," Rebecca whispered, tears streaming down her face. "Like we're supposed to forget our real mama ever existed." It was masterfully done. Blackwood had taken Rebecca's genuine struggle with divided loyalties and shaped it into evidence of Eva's manipulation. When he dismissed the girl, she fled the courtroom rather than return to her family's section, leaving her sisters looking lost and betrayed. The final blow came when Blackwood presented evidence of Eva's financial desperation. Bank records showed her arrival with $23, the sale of her wedding ring, and her acceptance of employment under what he termed suspiciously generous conditions. "Members of the community," Blackwood addressed the packed courtroom as if they were a jury, though this was technically a judicial hearing, "we see before us a pattern of calculated opportunism. A woman with questionable family connections arrives in our territory with no resources, no references, and no visible means of support. Within months, she has insinuated herself so completely into a grieving family that children who once honored their deceased mother's memory now call a stranger by that sacred title." When the morning session recessed, Eva felt hollow, scraped clean by the methodical destruction of her reputation. James tried to take her hand, but she pulled away, unable to bear the touch of someone whose children she was clearly going to lose. "Eva," he said quietly, "this isn't over." But it felt over. It felt like the end of everything she'd dared to hope for since arriving in this harsh, beautiful land that had seemed to offer second chances to broken souls. The afternoon session began with James's testimony, and Eva watched the man she'd come to love tear himself apart trying to defend her. He spoke of Eva's medical skills, her gentle way with the children, the peace that had returned to their household under her care. But Blackwood's cross-examination was surgical in its precision. "Sheriff Mackenzie, isn't it true that your wife specifically asked you to raise your daughters to remember their Apache heritage through language and cultural knowledge?" Sarah believed understanding was better than ignorance, yes. And yet, under Mrs. Thornfield's influence, this cultural education has been abandoned in favor of what she deems more appropriate activities. James hesitated, and Eva saw him realize the trap. Any answer would either betray Sarah's memory or confirm Eva's cultural interference. "My daughters are learning many things," he said carefully, "including how to replace their mother's memory with a stranger's affection." "Objection," the court-appointed defense attorney said weakly, but Blackwood overruled himself with judicial authority. As the afternoon wore on, Eva felt herself disappearing, becoming nothing more than a collection of suspicious circumstances and cultural misunderstandings. When Dr. Williams returned to testify about finding laudanum missing from his supplies after Eva's visits, she knew the end had come. The final witness was supposed to be Mercy, the youngest, but when court officers tried to bring the 6-year-old forward, she refused to leave Eva's side. Instead, she climbed into Eva's lap and spoke her first complete sentences in months. "Mama Eva, didn't steal me," Mercy said clearly, her small voice carrying in the hushed courtroom. "She saved me. When I couldn't talk because talking hurt too much, she waited. When I was scared of the dark, she sang. When I forgot what love felt like, she showed me." The courtroom erupted. Blackwood's gavel cracked like gunshots as he called for order, but Mercy continued speaking with the devastating honesty that only children possess. "Judge Mann," she said, looking directly at Blackwood, "why do you want to hurt people who love each other? Did somebody hurt you first?" The question landed like a physical blow. Blackwood's face went white, then red, then seemed to collapse inward, as if Mercy's innocent words had found and pressed on the exact center of his pain. "This court," he said, his voice shaking with emotion, "finds that the current custody arrangements are that the children's welfare requires—" He stopped, staring at Mercy's trusting face, at the 5 other girls who sat watching their world end, at Eva, who held the youngest with protective fierceness. "This court is in recess," he said abruptly, rising so quickly his robes billowed like storm clouds. "We will reconvene tomorrow morning for final judgment." As the courtroom emptied in confusion and whispered speculation, Eva remained seated with Mercy in her arms, surrounded by 5 other children who'd chosen to stand with her despite everything. Whatever tomorrow brought, she thought, at least she'd had this, the fierce, protective love of 6 children who'd decided she was worth fighting for. But deep in her heart, she feared that love might not be enough to overcome the law's cold judgment. That night, Eva sat on the porch of the boarding house where they'd taken rooms for the hearing, watching the desert stars and trying to memorize the sound of 6 children sleeping peacefully in the rooms behind her. Tomorrow would bring Judge Blackwood's final decision, and she'd seen enough of his pain-driven determination to know which way the wind was blowing. "Can't sleep either." James's voice came softly from the doorway. Eva shook her head, not trusting her voice. He settled beside her on the wooden bench, and they sat in silence for long minutes, listening to the distant sounds of Tombstone settling into uneasy sleep. "Eva," James said finally, "there's something I need to tell you about the night Sarah died." She turned to look at him, seeing the moonlight catch the silver in his hair, the lines that grief and responsibility had carved around his eyes. "Thomas Blackwood was with us that night. Young deputy, eager to prove himself. When the Apache hit the Henderson place, we rode out with a posse." James's voice grew distant, lost in memory. "Sarah insisted on coming. She could speak Apache, thought maybe she could prevent bloodshed." Eva felt her heart begin to race, sensing they were approaching the truth that had driven everything, the grief that had transformed a judge into an enemy. "The raid was already over when we got there. Apache had taken some children, left others dead. Sarah tracked the war party while we secured the scene, found them in Devil's Canyon, trying to tend their own wounded." James's hands clenched into fists. "She was negotiating, actually getting somewhere. Then Thomas—" "What happened?" Eva whispered. "Boy thought he was being a hero. Saw Sarah talking to the Apache chief and assumed she was in danger, opened fire without orders." James's voice broke. "Sarah was caught in the crossfire. Thomas took an arrow through the chest trying to reach her. Both died in my arms while I screamed for the shooting to stop." The revelation hit Eva like a physical blow. Sarah Mackenzie hadn't died in a raid on their ranch. She'd died trying to prevent exactly the kind of conflict that Judge Blackwood now seemed determined to perpetuate. And his son had caused her death through the same kind of fear and misunderstanding that was now threatening to destroy Eva's family. "Blackwood knows," James continued. "He knows his boy's mistake killed my wife. But grief makes men do terrible things. Sometimes it's easier to blame someone else than face the truth." Before Eva could respond, a commotion erupted from inside the boarding house. Rebecca's voice, sharp with panic. "Papa! Mama Eva! Something's wrong with Mercy!" They found the 6-year-old in the grip of a violent fever, her small body burning with heat that seemed to radiate like a furnace. Ava's medical training kicked in immediately. Cool cloths, willow bark tea, careful monitoring of pulse and breathing, but this was no ordinary childhood illness. "When did this start?" Eva asked Grace, who was holding her youngest sister's hand with white-knuckled intensity. "Right after we got back from court. She said her tummy hurt. Then she just got hot." Eva felt a chill that had nothing to do with the desert night air. She'd seen this pattern before in her father's practice. Sudden onset fever in a child under extreme stress, the body's way of shutting down when emotional trauma became too much to bear. "Dr. Williams," Faith said urgently. "Should we get Dr. Williams?" "No," Eva said firmly, then realized how that must sound. "I mean, I can treat her, but she needs calm, familiar faces, not more strangers." For the next 6 hours, Eva fought for Mercy's life while James held vigil and the older girls took turns cooling cloths and brewing tea. As dawn broke over Tombstone, the fever finally broke, leaving Mercy weak but coherent, clinging to Eva with desperate strength. "Mama Eva," she whispered, "are they going to take me away from you?" "I don't know, sweetheart," Eva replied honestly, because she'd learned these children could handle truth better than lies. "But whatever happens, you'll always be loved. That's something no judge can take away." When they arrived at the courthouse that morning, word of Mercy's illness had already spread. Eva carried the little girl, who was still too weak to walk, while the other children flanked them like a protective guard. The crowd parted before them, and Eva caught glimpses of faces that showed something different than yesterday's hostility. Concern, maybe even shame, at what their legal process had done to an innocent child. Judge Blackwood looked haggard when he took the bench, as if he'd spent the night wrestling with demons of his own. His usually immaculate appearance showed signs of sleeplessness and strain. "Before this court renders its decision," he began, his voice carefully controlled, "there are additional testimonies to be heard." To Eva's shock, Colonel Morrison strode forward, his military bearing commanding immediate attention. "Your Honor, I have a statement from Chief Red Cloud of the Apache Nation, delivered under flag of truce this morning." Blackwood's face tightened. "This court doesn't recognize Apache testimony." "With respect, Your Honor, this statement concerns territorial security and the prevention of future conflicts. I believe the court will find it relevant." Morrison unfolded a piece of bark covered in careful pictographs with English translation written below. Chief Red Cloud states that the woman called Healing Hands, Mrs. Thornfield, prevented a war that would have cost hundreds of lives. He offers formal alliance with any family under her protection, guaranteeing safe passage and peaceful relations. The courtroom buzzed with amazement. Eva felt faint with shock. Not only had her medical intervention saved one Apache child, it had apparently prevented a larger conflict that could have devastated the entire territory. But Blackwood wasn't finished. While this information is interesting, it doesn't address the fundamental question of child welfare. Mrs. Thornfield's actions, however well-intentioned, have placed these children in the center of dangerous controversies. That's when Rebecca stood up from the gallery, her 16-year-old voice cutting through the courtroom noise like a knife. "Your Honor," she said clearly, "I lied yesterday." The silence that followed was absolute. Blackwood's face went pale. "What did you say?" "I lied about Mama Eva making us call her Mama. The truth is, we started calling her that because she earned it. She didn't replace our real mama. She helped us remember what having a mama felt like." Rebecca walked forward, her chin raised with the courage that ran in the Mackenzie bloodline. "You want to know about Mrs. Thornfield's character? When Mercy was dying of fever last night, Mrs. Thornfield didn't sleep. She sat by her bed, bathing her forehead, singing lullabies, doing everything a real mama would do. That's who she is. Miss Mackenzie, Blackwood said sharply, perjury is a serious offense. So is stealing children from people who love them, Rebecca shot back. Sir, I know you lost your son. We lost our mama. But hurting more families won't bring back the people we've lost. The words hung in the air like an accusation and a plea. Ava saw Blackwood flinch as if he'd been struck, saw something crack in his carefully constructed facade of judicial authority. Then hope stood up, followed by faith, then grace, then charity. One by one, James's daughters rose to their feet in silent solidarity with their chosen mother. Even Mercy, weak as she was, struggled to stand in Eva's arms. We choose Mama Eva, Hope said simply. We choose our family. The courtroom held its breath as Judge Blackwood stared at the 6 girls who'd found the courage to speak truth to power. Ava saw the exact moment when his legal authority collided with his human heart, when the grieving father, underneath the judge's robes, finally broke through. Thomas, he whispered, so quietly only the front rows could hear. What have I done? He sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking every one of his 55 years. This court. He stopped, struggled, began again. This court has heard testimony that challenges every assumption upon which these proceedings were based. Blackwood removed his judicial glasses, rubbing his eyes like a man waking from a nightmare. Mrs. Thornfield, would you approach the bench? Eva handed Mercy to James and walked forward on unsteady legs, unsure whether she was approaching salvation or final condemnation. Mrs. Thornfield, Blackwood said quietly, I owe you an apology. I've allowed my personal grief to corrupt my judicial judgment. I've tried to punish you for finding the happiness that my son's death cost me. He paused, struggling with words that seemed to tear at his throat. The truth is, these children are thriving under your care in ways that no legal standard can measure. They've found love, security, and healing after devastating loss. To separate them now would be the cruelest kind of justice. Eva felt tears streaming down her face, but she couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't do anything but stand there as the world realigned itself around hope instead of fear. Therefore, Blackwood continued, his voice growing stronger, this court finds that the current custody arrangements serve the best interests of all parties involved. Mrs. Thornfield, I hereby grant you full legal guardianship of these children with all rights and responsibilities therein. The courtroom erupted in cheers and applause. Ava felt her knees buckle with relief, felt James's strong arms catch her as 6 children rushed forward to surround them in a tangle of hugs and tears and laughter. But Blackwood wasn't finished. Furthermore, he said, waiting for quiet, I would like to make a personal request. Mrs. Thornfield, these children will need educational opportunities as they grow. I would like to establish a fund for their schooling as a way of honoring my son's memory through investment in their futures. The transformation was complete. The man who'd tried to destroy their family was now offering to help secure it. Eva looked up at him through her tears and saw not a judge or an enemy, but a grieving father who'd finally found a way to channel his loss into something healing instead of destructive. Thank you, she whispered, and meant it with every fiber of her being. As they walked out of the courthouse into the bright Arizona sunshine, Eva realized that sometimes the greatest victories came not from defeating your enemies, but from helping them find their way back to their own humanity. The battle for her family was over. The journey of building it had just begun. 6 months after the courthouse victory, Ava stood in the kitchen of Copper Creek Ranch, watching James teach little Mercy how to braid leather reins, their heads bent together in concentration while autumn sunlight streamed through windows that had been replaced with real glass instead of oiled paper. The transformation of their home reflected the transformation of their lives. What had once been a place of survival had become a place of thriving. The wedding had taken place 3 weeks after the hearing, a simple ceremony under the cottonwood trees by the creek that gave the ranch its name. Judge Blackwood had officiated, his presence both a blessing and a symbol of redemption that the entire territory had witnessed. Colonel Morrison gave Eva away, while 6 daughters in matching blue dresses, sewn from fabric bought with Judge Blackwood's first contribution to their education fund, stood as bridesmaids. Mrs. Mackenzie, James had said as he slipped his mother's ring onto Eva's finger, "Will you have me in mine?" "Mr. Mackenzie," she'd replied through tears of joy, "I already do." The months that followed had brought changes none of them could have anticipated. Ava's medical practice had grown naturally from her courthouse testimony about treating Apache children. Families throughout the territory began seeking her out for everything from difficult births to rattlesnake bites, and her reputation as the doctor woman spread faster than desert wildfire. More surprisingly, her work had begun building bridges between communities that had viewed each other as enemies for generations. When Mrs. Patterson's grandson broke his arm in a fall, it was Grace who translated Apache healing techniques that helped the bone set properly. When an Apache woman struggled with a breech birth, it was Faith who guided the family to Eva's door, creating the first peaceful contact between the groups in over a decade. "Mama Eva," Charity called from the garden where she was harvesting the last of the autumn squash. "Mr. Blackwood's coming up the road." Eva smiled at the announcement. The judge's weekly visits had become a cherished tradition, his genuine affection for the children helping heal wounds that legal decisions alone could never touch. He'd become the grandfather figure none of them had expected, his transformation from enemy to family friend serving as proof that even the deepest grief could be channeled toward love instead of destruction. "Tell him supper will be ready in an hour," Eva called back, then turned to check on the bread rising in the warm spot behind the stove. These domestic moments still filled her with wonder, the simple miracle of belonging somewhere, of being needed and wanted and loved. Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway, 17 now and blossoming into a confident young woman who'd found her own way to honor both her birth mother's memory and her chosen mother's guidance. "Mama Eva, there's something I want to tell you about the letter." Eva looked up from the bread dough, noting the careful way Rebecca chose her words. Over the past year, they'd all learned to read each other's emotional weather with the precision of frontier families who depended on such knowledge for survival. "What letter, sweetheart?" "The one from Aunt Margaret in Boston. She wrote again, asking if I want to come east for finishing school." Rebecca paused, studying Eva's face for any sign of the hurt such letters had once caused. "I wrote back and told her I'm already being finished right here by the finest woman I know." The simple statement hit Eva with unexpected force. In the early days, she'd feared these children would eventually leave for the broader opportunities that Eastern relatives could provide. Instead, they'd chosen to stay and build their futures in the place that had become truly home. Though, Rebecca continued with a grin that reminded Eva forcefully of James, "I did ask if she could send some of those fashion magazines she mentioned. Grace wants to see if Eastern ladies really do wear all those buttons she's been hearing about." Before Eva could respond, Hope burst through the kitchen door with news that sent a familiar thrill of pride through Eva's chest. "Mama Eva, Papa, Mercy read a whole page from the Bible without stopping. A whole page!" The celebration that followed was typical of their household, spontaneous, joyful, and inclusive of everyone present. James swept Mercy into the air while the older girls applauded, and Eva felt that familiar tightening in her chest that came from watching a family function exactly as families should. Judge Blackwood arrived in time to witness Mercy's reading demonstration, his weathered face lighting up with grandfatherly pride as the 6-year-old carefully sounded out words from the Book of Psalms. Remarkable, he murmured to Eva as they watched. A year ago that child couldn't speak. Now she's reading scripture. Children are resilient, Eva replied, settling beside him on the porch bench that had become their traditional spot for conversation. They heal faster than adults, if given the chance. Speaking of healing, Blackwood said carefully, I have something to discuss with you and James about the future. Eva felt a familiar flutter of anxiety. Despite their newfound peace, she still struggled with the fear that happiness this complete couldn't possibly last. The territorial legislature is considering a proposal for establishing a proper medical college, Blackwood continued. They've approached me about recommending candidates for the founding faculty. Your name came up immediately. The suggestion took Eva's breath away. A medical college meant formal training for frontier physicians, better care for communities that currently had no access to professional medicine, and the chance to train other women in healing arts that were desperately needed. I'm not formally educated, Eva protested. I learned from my father, from experience, from necessity. You've learned from life, Blackwood corrected gently, and you've proven that healing requires more than textbook knowledge. It requires courage, compassion, and the ability to see past surface differences to the human need underneath. That evening, as the family gathered around the supper table that had once hosted only sorrow and now rang with laughter, James raised the subject of the medical college opportunity. The reaction was immediate and unanimous, 6 daughters insisting that Mama Eva was the smartest, bravest, most qualified doctor in the entire territory, possibly the entire United States. But what about the ranch? Eva asked practically. What about our family? The ranch isn't going anywhere, James said firmly. And neither are we. If you want to teach medicine, we'll make it work. Family means supporting each other's dreams, not limiting them. Grace, now 15 and showing signs of inherited medical curiosity, looked up from her plate with shining eyes. Could I study with you, Mama Eva? Could I learn to be a doctor too? The question opened a vista of possibilities Eva had never dared imagine. Not just her own chance to contribute to frontier medicine, but the opportunity to train a new generation of healers who understood that compassion was as important as competence. We'll see, Eva said, but her smile promised that we'll see meant absolutely yes. Later, as James and Eva sat on their porch watching the desert stars emerge in the vast Arizona sky, she reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment of perfect contentment. Do you ever think about what would have happened if I hadn't answered your advertisement? She asked, leaning against his shoulder with the comfortable intimacy of people who'd chosen each other consciously and completely. Every day, James replied quietly, and every day I thank God that you did. You didn't just save my children, Eva. You saved me. From inside the house came the soft murmur of 6 daughters getting ready for bed, their voices blending in the evening prayers that had become their family tradition. Each girl added her own personal thanks, for health, for happiness, for the security of knowing they were loved and wanted and safe. Thank you, God, for Mama Eva, Mercy's clear voice carried through the window, and for making us a real family again. Eva felt tears prick her eyes, but they were tears of gratitude rather than sorrow. She'd come to Arizona as a broken woman seeking nothing more than honest work and a chance to start over. Instead, she'd found her purpose, her partner, and her children. Not the children of her body, but the children of her heart, which turned out to be just as strong a bond. As the desert night settled around Copper Creek Ranch, Eva thought about the medical college opportunity, about the students she might train, about the lives she might touch through teaching others to heal. But mostly, she thought about the miracle of second chances, about how love could grow in the most unlikely soil when tended with patience and courage. Some folks say you can't choose your family, she murmured, repeating words that had become her personal truth. Turns out, sometimes family chooses you. James's arm tightened around her shoulders as the first stars appeared over the desert horizon, bright and steady as promises in the clear Arizona sky. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities, new chances to build on the foundation they'd created together. But tonight, it was enough to sit surrounded by the sounds of home and count the blessings that had grown from the simple courage to answer an advertisement for a cook and stay to become a mother instead. Dear friends, Eva Thornfield's story reminds us that life's greatest chapters often begin when we think the book is ending. At 32, widowed and broken, she answered a simple job advertisement that changed everything. How many of us have felt that familiar ache, wondering if our best years are behind us, if love and purpose only belong to the young? Eva discovered what many of us forget in our later decades. Family isn't just blood, it's choice. Home isn't just a place, it's where hearts heal together. In today's world, where families scatter across continents and retirement can feel like irrelevance, Eva's courage speaks directly to our deepest fears and hopes. She proved that starting over at any age isn't just possible, it's where miracles happen. Those 6 children didn't need perfection, they needed presence. Judge Blackwood didn't need revenge, he needed redemption. James didn't need to forget his past, he needed someone brave enough to help him build a future. Sometimes the family we create is stronger than the one we're born into. Sometimes the second half of life holds more joy than we ever dared imagine. What moment in your life taught you that it's never too late to start over? Have you ever found family in unexpected places? Share your story in the comments below. Your courage might inspire someone else to take that first brave step.